text for this morning is Job 13. Thank you. Our text for this morning is Job 13. Since we have some visitors, I'll catch you up. In the first couple of chapters of Job, Job loses everything he has. And God allows, through a dispute with the devil, everything of Job's to be taken away. It's not because Job has done something wrong. Job is pronounced as blameless. From the very first chapter of Job, Job is not being punished for sin. Yet three friends come, Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, and each of them accuse him of sin. They believe in something called the doctrine of retribution, which is a wrong doctrine. And this doctrine teaches that God always rewards good and always punishes evil, which can't be true because we live in a world where the evil often prosper and the righteous often suffer. So their doctrine was wrong. Yet each of the gentlemen take a shot at Job, and Job answers each one in his integrity, claiming that he has no secret sin and he is no hypocrite towards the things that they've accused him of. And this goes on for 3 cycles. And here in this morning's text, we're coming to the end of our first cycle, where Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have all spoken, and Job has answered them. And now in this 3-chapter section, we're in the middle of these 3-chapter section here in chapter 13, Job is answering all 3 of his friends and against their doctrine of retribution. So last week we looked at chapter 12. 12, 13, and 14 are all one continuous speech by Job. This morning we'll look at the middle portion of that here in chapter 13. So Job chapter 13, beginning at verse 1, we'll be looking at the whole chapter, verses 1 to 28, briefly. Verse 1, Job continues in his discourse. Lo, mine eye hath seen all this, mine ear hath heard it and understood it. I know also as much as you know. I am not inferior unto you. But I will speak to the Almighty, and I desire to dispute with God. For indeed ye forge lies, and all you are physicians of no value. Oh, that you would hold your tongue, that it might be imputed to you for wisdom. Now hear my disputation, and give ear to the arguments of my lips. Will you speak wickedly for God's defense, and talk deceitfully for this cause? Will you accept his person, or will you contend for God? Is it well that he should seek of you? Will you make a lie for him, as one lieth for a man? He will surely reprove you if you do secretly accept any person. Shall not his excellency make you afraid, and his fear fall upon you? Your memories may be compared unto ashes, and your bodies unto bodies of clay. Hold your tongues in my presence, that I may speak, and let come upon what will. Wherefore do I take my flesh in my teeth, and put my soul in my hand? Lo, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, and I will reprove my ways in his sight. He shall be my salvation also, for the hypocrite shall not come before him. Hear diligently my words, and mark my talk. Behold now, if I prepare me to judgment, I know that I shall be justified. Who is he that will plead with me? For if I now hold my tongue, I die. But do not these 2 things unto me, then will I not hide myself from thee. Withdraw thine hand from me, and let not thy fear make me afraid. Then call thou, and I will answer, or let me speak, and answer thou me. How many are mine iniquities and sins? Show me my rebellion and my sin. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and takest me for thine enemy? Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro, and wilt thou pursue the dry stubble? For thou writest bitter things against me, and makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly unto all my paths, and makest the print thereof in the heels of my feet. Such a one consumeth like a rotten thing, and is a garment that is moth-eaten. The title of our sermon this morning, Job Answers All 3 Friends, part 2 of 3. This is the middle part. And now our introduction. You may follow in your bulletin if you like. The sermon is printed there word for word. In this chapter, we have the middle of Job's complaint against the words of his 3 friends. This speech covers chapters 12 through 14 and serves as the end of the first cycle and the beginning of the second. This speech here in chapters 12 through 14 is best divided into 2 sections. The first section covers chapter 12, verse 1, which we started looking at last week, to the middle of our text today, chapter 13, verse 19, in which Job speaks directly to his friends. Then starting in chapter 13, verse 20, which we'll get to today, to the end of chapter 14, which we'll finish next week, in which Job speaks directly to God with his friends present. Job began the speech in chapter 12 by rebuking his friends who believed Job was being punished by God. We know that he wasn't. Job explained that their doctrine of retribution model led them to this false understanding that he must have sinned. Job argued that his recent experiences have taught him that the will of God is not as knowable or reasonably explained as his friends would like to believe. And that's what we looked at in chapter 12. There are 3 points to our message this morning, verses 1 to 12. Job prepares his friends to be impartial witnesses. Verses 13 to 19, Job tells his friends how he will dispute with God. And verses 20 to 28, Job begins his dispute with God, which won't end until chapter 14. Now our context for this particular portion of Scripture. We've had a lot of blackouts recently. Don't know why. We'll try to go on. Context. In this morning's text, Job rebukes his friends' arrogance for believing that they alone could understand the mind of God, especially above the understanding of Job, verses 1 to 12. Next, Job explains to his friends that he is about to enter into a legal dispute with God, and that they should prepare themselves to be honest witnesses, verses 13 through 19. Lastly, Job will address God, verses 20 through 28, and all of chapter 14. Job boldly questions God in an attempt to receive an answer as to the reason why God has treated Job so harshly. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 12. Job prepares his friends to be impartial witnesses. Verses 1 to 3 says this. Lo, mine eye has seen all this, says Job in response to his friends. Mine eye has seen all this, all these things that you've said to me. Mine ear hath heard and understood it. I know also as much as you know. I am not inferior unto you, but I will speak to the Almighty, and I desire to dispute with God. Dispute is a legal term. Job's opening remarks here bring an end to the subject of chapter 12 that we looked at last week. The purpose of chapter 12 was to show that his friends were not above Job in understanding, and they did not have a better understanding of the sovereign workings of God beyond Job's. Job argued that mine eye has seen all this that his friends had said. Mine ear heard it and understood it, meaning his friends had not enlightened him with any knowledge of God that he did not already know. Job makes clear that his understanding of God's ways is not inferior to that of his friends. He knows as much as they know, he says. The question to be debated is, what do God's actions towards Job mean? Why is God acting this way to Job? That's what needs to be answered. What part of God's nature is represented in allowing the blameless Job to suffer? How is that part of God's nature? That's what needs to be answered. Verse 3. But I will speak to the Almighty, says Job, and I desire to dispute with God. Job reasons that since he can gain no satisfaction or fair hearing by speaking with his friends, due to their severity in speech, the assuredness of their position, and their condescending words against Job's defense, that he would do better to speak directly to God, who is, of course, a fair and perfect witness. For although it appears that God may be angry with Job at the time, even to pit oneself against the righteous anger of God may result in a fairer hearing than toiling with the falsehood of his friends. Job now enters upon a new subject. He speaks to God in legal terms, saying that he desires to dispute with God. Job imagines a trial in which he will plead his cause before God, and God will provide Job with reasons for his harsh treatment. Job wants to hear from God but he also wants his friends silenced by God's rebuke. Verse 4, Job now gets very harsh with his friends. He says, "For indeed ye," his three friends, "forge lies, and all you are physicians of no value." That would be physicians of the soul. Before Job begins his dispute with God, which we won't get to until the 20th verse, he has something to tell his friends. Job implies that his friends may be called into this dispute with God to explain their doctrinal lies. Doctrine of retribution is a doctrinal lie. If God should enter this dispute and speak, Job has no doubt that he will be acquitted, and his friends are the ones that will be rebuked. So far, Job complains they have been witnesses who have not correctly examined the facts of the case, and therefore they have unfairly interpreted the actions of God. Job complains that although they attempt to defend God or take God's side, they have not done so lawfully. They have not examined the case correctly, and consequently they've shown favoritism to God by advocating a view that God himself would not agree with. They have also refused to listen to Job and his defense, even calling Job a hypocrite. They have failed to understand Job's explanation that God does not always punish the wicked. Sometimes they get away with it for a while. And he does not always reward the righteous. We don't get a reward for everything we do right. For at times the wicked prosper and the righteous do suffer. Job warns them that God will punish them as false witnesses for their inability to promote a doctrine that rightly explains God's actions towards Job. So verse 5 says, Job says, "Oh, that you would hold your tongue, that it might be imputed to you for wisdom." Job thinks it would be a credit to them if they would say no more in reference to their defense of God, having said too much already and misrepresented God in his defense. He tells them plainly that they take the wrong way to condemn Job, for in their attempts to justify God, which might be partially more to condemn Job, they have limited the sovereignty of God, put him in a box that he's not confined to. Job reminds them that if they do not have a view that could fully explain the sovereign ways of God, then they would have been better to say nothing. It's similar to our proverb today. Better to remain silent and thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. Or in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 28, where it says, "Even a fool, when he holds his peace, is accounted wise." Had they said nothing, Job would have respected their silence, assuming that they were wise enough to remain silent. But having pretended to be wise, they've spoken falsehoods and shown themselves to lack wisdom. For Job, silence is evidence of wisdom because it gives a person time to think and to hear before they talk. Verses 6 through 8, Job goes on to his friends. "Now hear my disputation, and give ear to the arguments of my lips." He's about to address God, so he tells his friends, "Now listen carefully to my dispute with God, because you're going to be witnesses. Will ye speak wickedly for God's defense and talk deceitfully for his cause? Will ye accept his person, or will you contend for God?" In other words, are you ready to bring that false doctrine into a court where God is judge? As Job prepares to dispute with God, he tells his friends to listen carefully to what he is about to say to God. Job explains that while the three friends attempted to defend God, their views of God dishonored him. In this legal dispute, they cannot speak lies or plead wrongly in the name of God. Job asks, "Will you think to contend for God?" As if his justice were clouded and it needed to be cleared up by you. Or as if God was at a loss for what to say and wanted you to speak for him. As the old proverb goes, good work ought not to be put into bad hands. Under the pretense of justifying God, they have afflicted Job wrongly. and condemned him as a hypocrite. This, says Job, is speaking wickedly. They must not think because they take up the cause of God that they will be excused for their doctrinal error. Their good intentions will not justify false words and actions. God's truth does not need our lie. It's a serious violation of the ninth commandment to speak falsely. But it is an additional aggravation of the ninth commandment to speak falsely in the name of God. Verse 9, Job goes on speaking to his friends, threatening them really. Is it well that he should seek of you? Will you make a lie for him as one lieth for a man? Job tries to show them that in this dispute he's about to have with God, they are the ones who should fear God's judgment, because they are the ones pretending a zeal that falsely defends God's honor. Job implies that false flattery is a form of mockery. So Job argues God is mocked by your defense. Job asks, can you bear to have your doctrines and motives searched out by God in this coming trial? And are you prepared to defend your treatment of me? What might God say if he should explore the whole matter about how you have represented him and rebuked me? He asks them. Job, in verse 10, gives them their answer. He will surely reprove you if you do secretly accept any person. Job says that God will be far from being pleased with your rebuke of me, says Job. Even though you clothed your rebuke under the fabric of vindicating God. Many lies have been told in the name of God. God will resent the misuse of his name, especially because it was done under the motive of advancing themselves as wise. Job wonders aloud, when God searches your thoughts, will he find you advancing the interests of God's honor or your own interests in appearing wise? Then he warns that anything they might say or do secretly will not escape the mind of God, who sees motives and punishes them. Finally, our last two verses of this first point, verses 11 and 12. Shall not his excellency make you afraid? In other words, aren't you afraid to go into court with a God and lie? And his fear fall upon you? Your memories may be compared unto ashes, and your bodies unto bodies of clay. Job warns his friend to be careful before God. So far they have falsely represented God and Job. If they should appear before God and reach such conclusions, the same conclusion, it is they, not Job, who will be in danger of judgment. Job asks, are you not afraid to say what is false and uncharitable before God? Does he take false testimony lightly? Job warns all their wise sayings, that's another word for this, memories in the text, their wise sayings will be like ashes and clay. Now ash is light, it's superficial, and it's worthless because it's the residue of useful wood. Clay is used to make pots, but of course it becomes worthless when the pots are broken. Job says their so-called wise sayings will have the worthless value of ash and broken pottery. That's what that proverb means. We come to our second point, verses 13 through 19. Job tells his friends how he will dispute with God. Just before he gets ready to dispute, in verse 20 he says, this is how I'm going to do it. Verse 13 to 16, he tells his friends, hold your tongues in my presence, that I may speak, and let come upon what will. Wherefore do I take my flesh in my teeth and put my soul in my hand? Lo, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, and I will reprove my ways in his sight. He shall be my salvation also, for the hypocrite shall not come before him. Job is not quite ready to begin his address to God. Before he does so, he will prepare his friends to listen and not interrupt his speech to God. Job recognizes the great danger of entering into an address with God. It is dangerous and could bring a quick end to his life. Verse 14, he says, I take my flesh in my teeth and put my soul in my hand. It is even hopeless and suicidal, according to verse 15. Nevertheless, Job will risk it all. He has nothing to lose but everything to gain in a dispute with God. Although it is likely that God will not tolerate his insubordination, Job must know what he has done and why God has removed his presence from him. Not knowing for Job is worse than the suffering he's going through now. His salvation or hope lies in his complete confidence that he is blameless, which he is. His confidence lies in believing a holy God will always vindicate a man with integrity. Verses 17 through 19. He says again to his friends, "Hear diligently my words and mark my talk. Behold now, if I prepare me to judgment, I know that I shall be satisfied. Who is he that will plead with me? For if I now hold my tongue, I die." Job now expresses his confidence in his own cause. He knows he's a sinner, but not to the degree that he's been punished. To the best of his knowledge, he should fear nothing, but we know he's not being punished. To the best of his knowledge, he should fear nothing. Job can even allow himself to joy in his own acquittal, or at least the reason to know why he must suffer so. Job says that it's likely that he will be bested by God in the dispute, and if and when that is the case, he will hold his tongue and remain silent until the day of his death. Which is very interesting, because ironically, that's exactly what happens in Job 40. When God addresses Job, Job 40, chapter 4 and 5, God does speak. And what's the first thing Job does? He puts his hand over his mouth to show that he's not going to speak anymore in the presence of God, because no one can speak like God. We come to our third point, verses 20 through 28. Job begins his dispute with God. Now Job, we switch in our text, where Job is no longer talking directly to his friends. Now he's talking directly to God, while his friends are watching him talk directly to God. Verses 20 through 28, beginning verses 20 through 22. Job speaking to God says this, "But do not these two things unto me, then will I not hide myself from thee. Withdraw thine hand from me, and let not thy fear make me afraid. Then call thou, and I will answer, or let me speak, and answer thou me." Job is now ready to speak to God and not hide himself from thee, as the text says. But he'll only do so on two conditions. The first condition is that God will not immediately punish him for his sins. The holiness of God is poison to sin. And the divine presence will not permit sin to exist in his presence. Why we need a Savior to get to heaven. So Job asks that God allow a sinner himself to be in the presence of God without his immediate destruction. He also asks God to not lay his hand on Job more heavily than he's already done, or break his will in his attempt to defend himself, because if he should do that, it'll render him unable to speak or even defend himself. Secondly, Job asks that the fear of God that comes upon all men when in the presence of the Almighty God, example throughout all of the Old Testament, be lifted, so that he can speak in his right mind without fear. Those are the conditions he needs to speak to God. If God will agree to these two conditions, Job says, then call thou, and I will answer. Or, then let the trial begin. I will be attentive to your words, God, and will be eager to hear what you have against me, as well as ask questions of you, God, concerning the rapid change in your demeanor towards me, and what I believe to be the disproportionate punishment of my sins. And now in verse 23, Job jumps right into it. Job asks God, "How many are mine iniquities and sins? Show me my rebellion and my sin." So Job's discourse begins with an attack. He demands to know from God what his sins are that has put him in the state that he's in. Job desires a catalog of all the sins that justify God's harsh treatment of him. Job's friends have been very eager to show Job his sin, but they failed to name them specifically. Just randomly talked about secret sins he must have committed. Since God knows all, reasons Job, he should have no trouble telling Job exactly what his hidden sins are. Job believes that if his sins are brought to light, his friends will soon realize that they are very few. And they had no right to accuse him of being a hypocrite and all these other secret faults. Verse 24, Job continues to ask God, "Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and takest me for thine enemy?" Job bitterly complains of God withdrawing his presence from him. Why, he asks, did God change his demeanor suddenly? And why did he bring such severe and sudden calamities on him that we read about in chapters 1 and 2? And when these calamities were over, why did God hide his face and refuse to converse with Job? To show no friendliness to Job or even comfort towards the suffering Job, even ignoring Job in the mind of Job. Job likens this treatment to the manner in which one would treat their enemy. But Job wants to know when, how, and why did he become God's enemy. Verse 25. This is an old proverb. Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro, and wilt thou pursue the dry stubble? Job here is using this proverb to tell God what it feels like to be his enemy. He compares his plight to two objects from nature, a leaf and dry stubble. Dry stubble means dry hay. Both the fallen leaf and the cut hay have been separated from their life-giving source. The leaf has fallen from the tree that, of course, sustained and gave it life. And the hay has been cut from the ground, its source of life, the ground. But these two objects are not left simply to die. It's as if someone immediately comes along and tramples upon them, cruelly trampling upon objects that are already soon to be dead. Job compares himself to these two objects. Job, he says, he is dying physically and psychically, like the fallen leaf or the cut hay. But still God pursues him, trampling upon his soul that is already near to death. Of course, he's overstating his case. And finally, our last three verses, verses 26 to 28. For thou writest bitter things against me, and makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly unto all my paths, and makest the print thereof in the heels of my feet. Such a one consumeth like a rotten thing, and as a garment that is moth-eaten. When Job says that God writeth bitter things against me, it refers to a judge who writes a sentence or a script against a prisoner. Job says that he has even searched the sins of his youth to see what sin might have brought God to this degree of anger. But even, Job says, when he searched his youth, the punishment for his crimes seemed disproportionate. Job does not know if God is punishing him for the sins of his youth, but since he can find nothing in his adulthood worthy of all this, he decides to look into the sins of his youth. Furthermore, Job complains that God puttest my feet also in the stocks, which refers to an oppressive tyrant who imprisons his subjects without a trial unfairly, or without knowledge of any crime. If Job cannot find his own sins, he reasons that God must look at Job's life with the greatest of scrutiny. He says, thou lookest narrowly unto all my paths. And he marks every footprint of Job. That's what the text means when it says, the print thereof in the heels of my feet. In order to find Job's smallest fault, so that, in Job's mind, he can punish it disproportionately and cruelly. The figure of Job is here described as becoming like a rotten thing, like a garment that has been slowly eaten by a moth. So the body and mind of Job do wear away. Job desires to know what sin he has committed deserving of such suffering. We'll end there. He completes his speech in chapter 14, and there we'll see what he's driving to. But before we do that, let's draw some applications. Because remember, this is poetry. And Job often overstates his case, saying things that to us seem somewhat blasphemous. So we have to draw out of it what is right and separate